The Peaky Blinders weren't just random criminals. They were the product of Birmingham's unique history. This city spent centuries rejecting authority, welcoming dissenters, and operating outside traditional controls. That independence helped Birmingham become one of the places where industrial methods spread fastest. But after World War I, unemployment, demobilisation, and weak social support created a vacuum that criminal networks were able to exploit. This documentary covers all 1,400 years. Anglo-Saxon origins, the crucial 1166 Market Charter, religious nonconformists, the Lunar Society, Victorian boom, the gang era, 2 world wars, and eventual regeneration. Understanding the Peaky Blinders means understanding why Birmingham developed differently from many other British cities. When Roman soldiers abandoned Britain in the early 5th century, they left behind roads, walls, and empty villas that gradually disappeared into overgrown forests. The urban civilization they'd maintained for nearly 4 centuries collapsed within a generation. Small groups of Anglo-Saxon farmers and warriors began moving into the abandoned lands, but they avoided the old Roman towns. They preferred river valleys and woodland clearings where they could farm, raise animals, and build simple settlements from scratch. Somewhere around the year 600, a group of Anglo-Saxons following a leader named Bjorma settled along the River Rhea in the thickly wooded heart of what we now call the Midlands. The settlement they established became known as Birmingham, the homestead of Bjorma's people. The name followed standard Anglo-Saxon naming patterns, combining a personal name with the suffix "ingum" to indicate a family group or tribal unit. These early settlers cleared patches of forest for crops, grazed livestock in woodland pastures, and hunted deer and wild boar in the surrounding woods. The settlement grew slowly over the next few centuries, but it never became anything impressive. Archaeological evidence from similar Anglo-Saxon sites shows communities of perhaps 10 to 20 families living in timber-framed halls with thatched roofs. Dirt paths connected scattered farmsteads rather than forming organized streets. Birmingham sat far from the major power centers of Anglo-Saxon England. There were Roman roots in the wider area, but no Roman town here, no great monastery nearby, and no royal estate dominating daily life. The people here simply farmed the land and passed their days in relative obscurity. By the 7th century, Birmingham became part of the Kingdom of Mercia, which controlled most of central England and competed with Wessex and Northumbria for dominance. Mercia's kings ruled from places like Tamworth and Repton, while Birmingham remained a minor agricultural settlement that provided grain, livestock, and labor when demanded. The settlement's residents owed obligations to local lords, who in turn owed service to the Mercian king. But the chain of authority rarely resulted in direct royal attention. Christianity spread through Mercia during the 7th and 8th centuries, changing how people buried their dead and marked the passage of time. Churches replaced pagan shrines, and priests recorded births and deaths in ways that oral tradition hadn't. But daily life for farmers in Birmingham continued to revolve around planting seasons, harvest yields, and livestock breeding. Kinship networks determined social standing. Local assemblies resolved disputes, and oral traditions preserved laws and customs without written records. The 9th century brought Viking raids that devastated much of Mercia. Danish armies conquered large portions of eastern England and established their own kingdoms. Birmingham's location in the Mercian heartland meant it experienced the disruption and instability of these conflicts, though no chronicles record specific battles or raids at the settlement itself. The Vikings eventually settled and converted to Christianity, becoming absorbed into Anglo-Saxon society. One detail stands out across these centuries. The name Birmingham survived essentially unchanged for over 1,400 years. While countless other settlements disappeared or changed names beyond recognition, this obscure farming village retained its identity through Roman withdrawal, Viking invasions, and successive waves of political upheaval. When Norman scribes recorded English place names after 1066, they wrote Birmingham, a minor variation that preserved the original Anglo-Saxon name. By the time William the Conqueror's officials arrived to catalog England's wealth, Birmingham was still just a rural village, but it had quietly endured for half a millennium. William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings in 1066 triggered a wholesale transfer of English land into Norman hands. The king needed to reward the knights and lords who had fought for him while simultaneously crushing any possibility of Anglo-Saxon resistance. He parceled out estates across England to men who owed him personal loyalty and could be trusted to enforce Norman control over a hostile population. Birmingham, along with thousands of other settlements, simply changed owners. The Anglo-Saxon families who had lived there for generations now answered to foreign masters who spoke French and operated under different legal principles. Control of Birmingham went to William Fitzansculf, a Norman knight who received enormous landholdings centered on Dudley Castle, about 10 miles northwest of the settlement. Fitzansculf never lived in Birmingham. It was just one small manor among dozens he controlled. He extracted value from the land while leaving day-to-day management to local officials who collected rents and enforced obligations. The settlement now existed within a feudal hierarchy where everyone occupied a defined legal position with specific duties attached. Peasants owed labor service to the manor lord. The manor lord owed military service to his superior, and chains of obligation ran all the way up to the king. The physical landscape didn't transform overnight. Timber halls and thatched buildings still dominated. Fields still needed plowing, and livestock still needed tending. But Norman administrators imposed new frameworks onto this familiar pattern. They measured landholdings precisely, recorded who owed what services, and created written documentation of obligations that had previously existed only through oral tradition and custom. Courts operated under Norman law rather than Anglo-Saxon custom. Penalties for breaking rules became harsher and more systematized. The Normans brought bureaucracy to rural England. In 1086, royal clerks arrived to compile the Domesday Book, William's massive survey of English wealth designed to maximize taxation. Birmingham appeared in the survey as a minor entry under Fitzansculf's holdings. The settlement had land for 6 plows, a small amount of woodland, and a population of perhaps a dozen peasant families. The recorded annual value came to just 20 shillings, roughly what a skilled craftsman might earn in 2 months. Nearby manors were worth several pounds, making Birmingham economically trivial by comparison. The low valuation meant the settlement contributed almost nothing to the wealth that sustained Norman power. It could have easily been abandoned or absorbed into neighboring estates without anyone noticing. Yet that low value also meant Birmingham faced minimal interference. No powerful lord decided to build a castle there or establish a major administrative center. The settlement continued producing grain and livestock, paying its modest rents, and existing beneath the notice of anyone important. Norman rule did establish something useful, though. Clear legal boundaries, documented ownership, and formal incorporation into England's governmental structure. These frameworks would matter later, even if they seemed meaningless at the time. By 1150, the manor remained stable and unremarkable. Peasants farmed their assigned strips of land, paid their dues, and lived lives that differed little from their great-grandparents' experiences. Birmingham had survived another regime change without being destroyed or significantly altered. New economic forces were beginning to stir across England, reaching even isolated rural communities that had changed little for centuries. England's population began climbing in the mid-12th century after generations of slow growth. More people meant more demand for food, tools, and goods that rural estates couldn't produce themselves. Trade networks that had withered after Rome's collapse started functioning again. Coins circulated more widely. Roads saw increased traffic. Even settlements tucked away between major centers found themselves connected to broader economic currents. Birmingham sat roughly equidistant from established towns like Coventry, Worcester, and Lichfield, placing it in a zone where farmers and craftsmen needed somewhere local to buy and sell. In 1166, Peter de Birmingham, descendant of the Norman family that had held the manor since the conquest, obtained a royal charter granting him the right to hold a weekly market. This wasn't automatic. Charter grants required payment to the crown and often faced opposition from nearby towns that wanted to protect their own markets from competition. Peter's successful petition meant Birmingham could now legally hold regular trading sessions where people gathered to exchange goods under royal protection. Anyone disrupting the market faced royal justice rather than just manorial discipline. The weekly market created a focal point where the settlement's rhythm changed from purely agricultural to something more complex. Farmers from surrounding hamlets brought grain, livestock, eggs, and wool to sell. Craftsmen set up temporary stalls offering leather goods, simple tools, and pottery. Traders arrived with salt, fish, and other goods from further away. Transactions that had previously happened sporadically through barter and personal relationships now occurred on a predictable schedule, using silver pennies alongside traditional exchanges. People who lived miles apart met regularly, shared information, and created relationships that extended beyond their immediate villages. The market needed infrastructure. Peter de Birmingham laid out plots around the market area where people could build permanent structures. Shops appeared. Simple timber buildings where merchants stored goods and conducted business. Workshops clustered nearby where craftsmen could produce items for immediate sale. Inns opened to house traders who traveled from distant areas and needed somewhere to stay overnight. Streets emerged organically as paths between these buildings became established routes. The settlement's physical form shifted from scattered farmsteads to a concentrated center with defined boundaries. Birmingham's population grew as people moved in to take advantage of market opportunities. Younger sons who couldn't inherit family farms found work in the growing number of workshops. Craftsmen from other areas relocated to be near the market. The settlement developed a mixed economy where agriculture still mattered, but commerce and craft production employed increasing numbers of people. Birmingham transitioned from being just a manor to being a market town with its own identity separate from the lord's estate. The charter gave Birmingham legal standing ahead of other settlements in the region that remained purely agricultural. Many places that seemed equally positioned never obtained market rights and stayed small. Birmingham grew while they didn't, not through any grand design, but through the simple accumulation of commercial activity over decades. The town never built walls or fortifications. No one saw reason to defend it militarily. This openness meant Birmingham expanded easily as needed without being constrained by defensive perimeters that limited other medieval towns. Birmingham's economy intensified during the 14th and 15th centuries in ways that set it apart from typical market towns. Rather than simply growing larger, the town developed deeper specialization. Craftsmen focused on particular products and refined their techniques, responding to what regional customers actually wanted to buy. The weekly market continued bringing people together, but increasingly those people came looking for specific metal goods that Birmingham had become known for producing. Metalworking began dominating the town's character as more craftsmen set up forges and workshops. They produced knives for kitchens and fields, buckles for belts and shoes, nails for construction, and hand tools for other trades. These weren't luxury items or specialized weapons. They were everyday objects that wore out and needed constant replacement. A blacksmith would set up a small forge behind his house, perhaps employing an apprentice or two, and spend his days hammering out dozens of identical buckles or hundreds of nails. The work was repetitive and the profit margins were thin, but steady demand kept the forges burning. The surrounding landscape made metalworking practical on this domestic scale. Forests still covered much of the area, providing wood that could be converted to charcoal for fuel. Local streams, though small, had enough flow to power simple bellows and trip hammers through basic water wheels. A craftsman didn't need massive capital investment to start producing. He needed a forge, some iron stock, basic tools, and enough skill to shape metal consistently. Birmingham's scattered workshops operated independently but created collective output that exceeded what any single large operation could have managed. Trade routes carried Birmingham products beyond the immediate region. Packhorse trains loaded with metalware followed established paths to Coventry's larger markets, to Worcester in the west, and to other towns where merchants redistributed goods to smaller communities. Birmingham buckles and knives ended up in villages across the Midlands, sold by traveling peddlers who bought stock in bulk and resold it at markup. The town developed a reputation for producing large quantities of acceptable quality goods at prices that made them accessible to ordinary people. Birmingham operated without the guild structures that controlled production in most English towns. Guilds set standards, limited competition, regulated who could practice trades, and enforced traditional methods. Birmingham had no powerful guilds because it had never become a chartered borough with the corporate authority to establish them. This absence meant skilled craftsmen could work without permission, experiment with new techniques, and undercut established prices. A metal worker who developed a faster way to make buckles could immediately implement it without getting approval from guild masters who might resist change. By the 14th century, people recognized Birmingham as a source for inexpensive, mass-produced metal items. The town had developed methods for making large quantities of standardized goods before anyone used the word manufacturing. Each workshop remained small, but together they functioned like a distributed production system. The Black Death struck England in 1348, killing perhaps half the population. Birmingham suffered along with everywhere else, but the town's flexible economy helped it recover. Labor shortages after the plague drove wages up and gave surviving workers more bargaining power and independence. Craftsmen who had worked for others could now set up their own shops. The metal trades continued operating because the demand for basic tools and hardware didn't disappear. The 16th century brought upheaval across England. Henry VII's break with Rome, the dissolution of monasteries, religious persecution under different monarchs, and economic disruption from inflation and land redistribution. Birmingham experienced these changes from a distance, continuing to grow while more prominent towns struggled with the consequences of religious and political conflict. The town entered 1500 with perhaps 1,500 residents and ended the century with around 2,500, steady expansion driven by manufacturing rather than administrative or ecclesiastical functions. Workshops continued multiplying throughout the 1500s. Each remained small, typically run by a master craftsman with perhaps 2 or 3 workers, but their collective number increased significantly. Metalworking expanded into more specialized branches. Some workshops focused exclusively on blades, others on locks and keys, still others on bits and stirrups for horses. The household remained the basic unit of production. A craftsman lived above or behind his workshop, his family helped with simpler tasks, and apprentices lived as part of the household while learning the trade. This pattern meant production was embedded in daily domestic life rather than separated into distinct industrial zones. The metal trades began supplying military equipment alongside civilian goods. Tudor England fought wars periodically and needed swords, daggers, armor components, and gun barrels. Birmingham's metalworkers could produce these items using the same skills and equipment they used for peacetime products. When demand for weapons rose, workshops converted quickly. When wars ended, they switched back to buckles and tools. This flexibility allowed the town to profit from military contracts without becoming dependent on them. Birmingham remained unusually independent from traditional sources of authority. No powerful aristocratic family dominated the area. The manor had passed through several hands, and the lords remained distant landlords collecting rents without exerting strong control. No cathedral or major monastery had ever been established there, so the church hierarchy had minimal local presence. No royal castle or administrative center gave government officials reason to intervene regularly. The town governed itself through informal networks of prominent craftsmen and traders who settled disputes and organized community needs without formal charters or legal authority. Roads carried Birmingham's output to markets across the Midlands and beyond. The town sat at the intersection of routes connecting major centers, making it accessible to pack horses and carts moving goods overland. Rivers defined most medieval trade, but Birmingham's location away from navigable waterways forced reliance on road transport. This actually helped the town develop different trading patterns based on flexibility and speed rather than bulk shipping. Birmingham was producing iron goods for export markets while still technically just a manor without borough status or official recognition as a town. Legal status mattered less than practical function. Merchants came to Birmingham because they could buy large quantities of metalware at competitive prices, not because of any charter or legal privilege. Reputation replaced formal authority as the basis for commercial relationships. Other towns declined during the 16th century as traditional industries failed or population shrank from disease and economic dislocation. Birmingham absorbed migrants looking for work and opportunities that had disappeared elsewhere. The absence of rigid guild structures or corporate monopolies meant newcomers could establish themselves by demonstrating skill rather than buying privileges or serving long apprenticeships in controlled trades. By 1600, Birmingham had developed a manufacturing culture that valued practical ability, accepted rapid adaptation, and operated with minimal external interference. Religious and political changes were about to bring new populations and new ideas that would accelerate these existing tendencies. Religious conflict intensified across England during the early 17th century as the Church of England consolidated its authority and demanded conformity. King James I and later Charles I insisted that all subjects worship according to prescribed Anglican liturgy, attend parish churches, and submit to bishops appointed by the crown. Those who refused faced fines, imprisonment, or worse. Protestant groups who had supported the Reformation but rejected the hierarchical structure of the established church found themselves persecuted as dangerous radicals. These dissenters, Puritans, Presbyterians, and various independent congregations, needed places where they could practice their faith and conduct business without constant interference. Birmingham offered exactly that kind of environment. The town had no resident aristocracy watching over moral conduct, no powerful church establishment enforcing attendance, and no corporate borough structure requiring religious oaths for participation in trade. Officials from Lichfield or London occasionally arrived to investigate reports of nonconformist activity, but they couldn't maintain permanent surveillance over a growing manufacturing town where people moved frequently and workshops operated independently. Dissenters relocated to Birmingham because they could worship privately, conduct business freely, and build lives without conforming to religious requirements that violated their consciences. Protestant nonconformity emphasized personal Bible reading, which required literacy. Dissenting families taught their children to read so they could study scripture directly rather than relying on priests to interpret it for them. This created a population with higher literacy rates than most English towns of comparable size. Literate craftsmen could read technical manuals, keep business records, and communicate through letters with distant trading partners. Their religious commitment to education produced practical economic advantages. Nonconformist theology stressed discipline, hard work, and honest dealing as evidence of godly living. Wealth earned through diligent labor was acceptable, even praiseworthy, unlike in traditions that viewed commercial success with suspicion. These beliefs align naturally with the values already present among Birmingham's manufacturing community. A craftsman who worked long hours perfecting his technique, dealt fairly with customers, and reinvested profits into expanding his workshop was living according to both religious principle and economic logic. Meeting houses appeared in private homes where small groups gathered for worship outside the official church structure. These gatherings were technically illegal, but authorities struggled to stop them in a town where neighbors protected each other and strangers were noticed quickly. Religious practice became embedded in daily social networks rather than separated into Sunday ceremonies at parish churches that most people attended reluctantly. Workshops continued multiplying during these decades as religious debate and economic expansion proceeded together. Families passed both trade skills and religious convictions to the next generation. Sons learned metalworking techniques from fathers while also absorbing theological views that emphasized independence from hierarchical authority. The combination created entrepreneurial dynasties that would dominate Birmingham for generations. Royal officials began viewing Birmingham with suspicion by the 1630s. Reports reaching London described a town full of religious radicals who ignored church courts and conducted illegal worship services. The town's reputation for resistance and reform was already established before political conflict erupted. When King Charles I and Parliament finally broke into open warfare in 1642, Birmingham's years of religious dissent and economic independence made the town's allegiance obvious. The parliamentary cause attracted nonconformists, merchants, and craftsmen who resented royal interference in religion and commerce. Birmingham's population supported Parliament almost unanimously, not through any official declaration, but through immediate practical action. The town had no garrison, no fortifications, and no military organization, yet within months it became a significant supplier of weapons to parliamentary armies. Birmingham's metalworkers converted their peacetime production to military equipment using the same small workshops that had produced civilian goods for decades. Forge masters who had made knives and tools began forging sword blades. Craftsmen who had manufactured locks started producing gun mechanisms. The distributed workshop system that had made Birmingham economically flexible now made it militarily valuable. Rather than relying on a single large armory that could be captured or destroyed, Parliament received weapons from dozens of independent producers scattered throughout the town. Even if Royalist forces seized part of Birmingham, other workshops would continue operating. The town's weapons output reached parliamentary commanders throughout the Midlands. Swords, pikes, musket barrels, and armor pieces moved out of Birmingham along the same road networks that had carried peacetime trade. Local metalworkers didn't receive formal contracts or central coordination. They simply made what parliamentary buyers would purchase and sold to whoever represented Parliament's interests. The arrangement was informal but effective. Royalist commanders recognized Birmingham as hostile territory, providing material support to their enemies. The town held no strategic position worth occupying. It controlled no river crossings, no major roads, and no defensive strongpoints. But its political allegiance and weapons production made it a target for punishment rather than conquest. Prince Rupert, commanding Royalist cavalry forces in the Midlands, decided to teach Birmingham a lesson about supporting rebellion. On Easter Monday 1643, Rupert's cavalry rode into Birmingham and attacked the town systematically. Residents tried defending themselves with improvised barricades and whatever weapons they could grab, but untrained civilians with pikes couldn't stop professional cavalry. The Royalists spent hours looting homes, burning buildings, and destroying workshops. They targeted metalworking facilities specifically, smashing forges and scattering tools. Several dozen residents died in the fighting or were killed after surrendering. The attack aimed to break Birmingham's will and eliminate its capacity to supply Parliament. The raid failed in both objectives. Physical damage was repaired within months as craftsmen rebuilt workshops and resumed production. The town's hostility toward royal authority intensified rather than diminished. Birmingham's experience under direct royalist attack confirmed what its residents already believed about the dangers of arbitrary power. Birmingham's role as weapons supplier continued throughout the war despite having no formal status or recognition. Parliamentary commanders simply knew they could obtain arms from Birmingham metalworkers who supported their cause. This informal supply network operated more reliably than official armories in some cases. Traditional governance structures barely functioned during the Civil War years, but Birmingham kept operating through networks of craftsmen and traders who organized necessary services themselves. When Charles I was executed in 1649 and England briefly became a republic, Birmingham had already spent years functioning outside royal authority. The town emerged from the conflict with its manufacturing base intact and its political identity forged through actual violence rather than abstract principle. Charles II returned to England in 1660 and restored the monarchy after 11 years of Republican government. The restoration brought back bishops, Anglican ceremony, and royal authority over religious practice. Parliament passed the Act of Uniformity in 1662, requiring all ministers to accept the Book of Common Prayer and submit to episcopal authority. Around 2,000 clergymen refused and lost their positions, creating a class of ejected ministers who continued preaching outside the official church structure. Birmingham welcomed many of these displaced preachers, who found audiences among families that had opposed royal power during the Civil War and still resented interference in religious matters. Manufacturing resumed quickly after the political turmoil ended. Workshops that had survived the war expanded their output as demand for civilian goods recovered. New craftsmen arrived looking for opportunities in a town known for letting skilled workers operate without excessive regulation. Metalworking remained the dominant trade, with forges producing the same range of knives, tools, buckles, and hardware that had sustained Birmingham before the war. Capital flowed back into the town as merchants recognized that Birmingham's distributed production system had proven more resilient than centralized operations in other areas. Nonconformist ministers couldn't preach in official churches, but they could teach, counsel families, and lead private worship gatherings. Birmingham's dissenting community organized education around these expelled clergymen, who operated small schools where children learned reading, writing, arithmetic, and scripture. These schools operated quietly, avoiding official attention while producing a generation educated beyond what parish schools provided. Parents paid modest fees, and the instruction emphasized practical skills alongside religious education. Religious exclusion created tighter bonds within the dissenting community. Families worshiped together in private homes, forming networks based on shared theological convictions. When a craftsman needed an apprentice, he often chose a boy from another dissenting family. When merchants needed reliable partners, they dealt with people who attended the same meetings. Business relationships grew from religious connections, creating economic networks that operated on trust and shared values rather than formal contracts or legal enforcement. The workshop system expanded through the late 17th century by multiplication rather than consolidation. Successful craftsmen trained apprentices who eventually set up their own shops nearby rather than remaining employees. Birmingham developed streets where nearly every building housed some form of metalworking operation, with residential quarters above or behind the workspace. This dense integration of production and daily life meant the town functioned as one large manufacturing complex without any single factory or coordinated management. Literacy rates among Birmingham's dissenting families exceeded national averages significantly by 1700. The emphasis on Bible reading and the availability of nonconformist schools produced a population that could read technical documents, maintain business records, and correspond with distant partners. This educational foundation gave Birmingham craftsmen advantages when adopting new techniques or expanding into unfamiliar markets. Formal government remained minimal and distant. Birmingham still lacked borough status, so it had no official corporation or chartered privileges. Residents organized necessary services themselves through voluntary cooperation. When roads needed repair, local workshops contributed labor. When disputes arose, respected craftsmen mediated rather than involving distant courts. The town developed civic structures based on mutual assistance rather than legal authority, reinforcing patterns of independence that had developed over generations. Birmingham spread outward during the early 18th century, growing along existing roads and creating new lanes as households built near the workshops where they worked. The town had no planned layout or coordinated development. Growth happened wherever someone decided to construct a building. Streets emerged organically as paths between structures became established routes. Houses pressed close together, sharing walls and creating dense blocks where residential and manufacturing spaces mixed without separation. A visitor walking through Birmingham would pass forge after forge, each one belching smoke from charcoal fires, each one producing clanging sounds of hammers on metal that echoed through narrow passages. The population climbed steadily throughout the first half of the century. People arrived from surrounding agricultural areas where opportunities had stagnated or disappeared. Younger sons with no prospect of inheriting land came looking for apprenticeships in the metal trades. Families displaced by enclosure of common lands relocated to Birmingham where work was available for anyone with useful skills or willingness to learn them. The town offered employment that didn't require permission from guilds or payment of entrance fees. A craftsman who could demonstrate competence could find customers and start earning immediately. Production volume increased year after year as more workshops opened and existing operations expanded. Birmingham manufactured buttons in enormous quantities, supplying much of England with brass, copper, and steel buttons for clothing. Buckles flowed from hundreds of small forges, each producing standardized designs that could be sold cheaply. Gun makers concentrated in certain districts, producing muskets and pistols through division of labor where different workshops handled barrels, locks, stocks, and assembly. Small tools, nails, hinges, locks, and countless other metal items came from Birmingham in volumes that older manufacturing centers couldn't match. The absence of guild control meant craftsmen competed directly on price and quality rather than operating within protected monopolies. A button maker who developed faster production methods could immediately undercut competitors, forcing them to improve or lose business. Innovation came from competitive pressure rather than official encouragement. Workshops experimented with new techniques, adopted successful practices from others, and discarded methods that proved inefficient. The lack of formal regulation created a dynamic environment where change happened constantly. Credit networks developed among Birmingham's manufacturing community as craftsmen needed capital to purchase raw materials, expand workshops, or survive slow periods. Informal lending arrangements between families replaced traditional reliance on aristocratic patronage or institutional banks. A successful manufacturer might lend money to a promising apprentice setting up his first shop, taking repayment from future production. Partnerships formed where one person provided capital and another contributed labor and skill, dividing profits according to negotiated terms. These arrangements operated on reputation and personal trust rather than legal contracts. Birmingham still possessed no borough charter or official corporate status during this period. The town functioned as a major manufacturing center while remaining legally just a manor and parish. Official recognition mattered less than practical capability. Birmingham produced goods, attracted workers, and generated wealth without needing royal permission or chartered privileges. Infrastructure struggled to keep pace with growth. Streets became crowded and often impassable when rain turned dirt paths to mud. Sanitation remained primitive, with waste disposal handled individually rather than through any organized system. Housing quality varied dramatically, from substantial homes of successful manufacturers to cramped tenements where multiple families shared space. The mismatch between the town's economic importance and its physical conditions created obvious need for improvement. Birmingham's manufacturing expansion during the mid-18th century attracted people beyond traditional craftsmen. Inventors, natural philosophers, and entrepreneurs arrived in a town that welcomed practical experimentation without requiring academic credentials or social standing. These individuals found Birmingham's commercial energy and intellectual openness far more stimulating than university towns where ancient institutions resisted new ideas. The town became a magnet for people who wanted to test theories, build machines, and profit from innovation. Informal gatherings among these thinkers and makers began happening regularly by the 1760s. A group that emerged called itself the Lunar Society because members scheduled meetings during full moons, allowing them to ride home safely by moonlight after evening discussions. No formal membership list existed, no dues were collected, and no official minutes recorded their conversations. The society operated as a network of friends who shared interests in science, engineering, and philosophy. Matthew Boulton established the Soho Manufactory in Birmingham in 1762, creating one of the largest industrial facilities in England for producing metal goods. His operation employed hundreds of workers and used water-powered machinery to increase production beyond what traditional workshops could achieve. Boulton wasn't just a manufacturer. He actively sought out inventors and scientists whose work might improve industrial processes. James Watt arrived in Birmingham in 1774 after Boulton agreed to finance development of Watt's improved steam engine design. The partnership between Boulton's manufacturing expertise and capital and Watt's engineering skill produced engines that transformed industrial power. Erasmus Darwin, a physician and natural philosopher, brought biological and evolutionary thinking into Lunar Society discussions. Joseph Priestley conducted chemistry experiments that led to discoveries about gases, including oxygen, while living in Birmingham during the 1780s. Josiah Wedgwood, the pottery manufacturer, contributed insights about industrial organization and product design. William Withering investigated medicinal plants and pioneered the use of digitalis for heart conditions. These figures met in each other's homes, examining specimens, discussing theories, and debating how natural philosophy connected to practical problems. Experiments happened in workshops and private laboratories rather than formal research institutions. Watt tested engine designs in Soho Manufactory buildings, using Boulton's facilities and workers to build prototypes. Priestley conducted chemistry experiments in his home laboratory, discovering new substances through trial and observation. The boundary between scientific investigation and commercial application barely existed. Discoveries moved directly from experimental apparatus to manufacturing processes. Birmingham provided an environment where intellectual work connected immediately to economic activity. University towns separated scholarly research from commerce, maintaining distinctions between gentlemanly learning and vulgar trade. Birmingham ignored these distinctions entirely. A manufacturer could discuss metallurgy with a natural philosopher in the evening and apply new techniques in his forge the next morning. Ideas circulated through conversation, letters, and direct collaboration rather than formal publications or academic lectures. The Lunar Society's influence extended beyond its immediate members through networks of correspondence and visiting scholars who came to Birmingham specifically to meet these innovative thinkers. Yet most of their meetings left no written record. What was discussed, what experiments were described, what problems were debated, much of this vanished because no one took formal notes. History got shaped in private rooms through conversations that no one documented. Steam engine improvements developed through Boulton and Watt's partnership fundamentally changed industrial power. Yet the intellectual process that produced these advances happened informally. By the 1790s, Birmingham's reputation rested equally on its manufacturing output and its capacity for innovation. The Industrial Revolution transformed northern England through massive textile mills powered by water wheels along fast-flowing rivers. Manchester, Leeds, and other factory towns built their economies around these centralized facilities where hundreds of workers operated mechanized looms under one roof. Birmingham developed along completely different lines. The town had no river capable of powering large mills, yet it became one of Britain's most productive industrial centers by distributing production across thousands of small workshops rather than consolidating it into factories. Steam engines arrived in Birmingham during the 1770s and 1780s through Boulton and Watt's partnership, but they didn't create the same transformation seen elsewhere. Instead of building large steam-powered factories, Birmingham's manufacturers installed small engines in individual workshops to supplement existing production methods. A button maker might add a steam engine to power polishing equipment while still relying on hand labor for most operations. A gun maker might use steam power for boring barrels while assembling mechanisms by hand. Steam became another tool rather than a force that reorganized entire industries. Skilled artisans remained essential throughout Birmingham's industrial expansion. Jewelry production employed craftsmen who worked precious metals into intricate designs that required individual attention and artistic judgment. Button manufacturing involved specialists who understood how different metals responded to forming and finishing processes. Gun making demanded precision work where tolerances measured in fractions of inches determined whether a weapon functioned reliably. Toy production, another major Birmingham industry by 1800, required workers who could assemble small mechanical parts into functioning products. These trades couldn't be reduced to simple repetitive motions performed by unskilled factory hands. The distributed workshop structure gave Birmingham unusual adaptability. A craftsman who developed an improved button design could implement it immediately in his own shop without convincing factory managers or reorganizing production lines. If the design sold well, other workshops copied it within weeks. If it failed, only one small operation suffered losses. New techniques and products spread through imitation and competition rather than centralized planning. This constant experimentation produced innovation at scales that large factories, committed to existing processes and equipment, couldn't match. Birmingham's output reached global markets during this period as British military and commercial expansion created demand for manufactured goods. The town supplied muskets and pistols to the British Army and Navy, producing weapons through networks of specialized workshops that each handled specific components. Colonial administrators purchased Birmingham hardware, tools, and consumer goods for export to territories across the empire. European and American merchants bought buttons, buckles, toys, and jewelry that Birmingham workshops produced in volumes no other center could match. Birmingham became one of Britain's most productive industrial towns without constructing the massive mills that defined the Industrial Revolution in popular imagination. Output per capita rivaled or exceeded textile towns, yet no dominant factory shaped the skyline or concentrated workers in single locations. The workshop system's distributed nature meant no single strike could halt production, and no mechanical breakdown could stop the entire industry. When problems occurred in one workshop, dozens of others continued operating. By the late 1760s, Birmingham's workshops could produce more than the town could move. Heavy carts loaded with metalwork ground through narrow medieval streets, creating bottlenecks that stretched for hours. Pack horses carried what they could, but the weight of coal needed to feed hundreds of forges exceeded what animals could deliver efficiently. Roads turned to mud in winter and dust in summer, slowing commerce to a crawl precisely when demand was climbing. The town had reached a ceiling not because craftsmen lacked skill or markets lacked appetite, but because physical transport had become the limiting factor in everything Birmingham tried to do. Canal construction arrived in 1768 and removed that ceiling entirely. The Birmingham Canal connected the town to the national waterway system, linking it directly to coalfields, ports, and cities that had previously required days of overland travel. Barges could carry 50 times what a pack horse managed, and they moved steadily regardless of weather or road conditions. Within months, the town's relationship to distance and supply transformed. What had been a regional manufacturing center feeding local markets suddenly became a node in a network that stretched to London, Liverpool, and eventually across the Atlantic to colonial territories. Coal prices fell dramatically almost immediately. Furnaces that had operated intermittently due to fuel scarcity now burned continuously, allowing metalworkers to take on orders that required weeks of sustained production. Iron arrived in bulk from Staffordshire foundries, while finished goods, buttons, buckles, guns, tools, and hardware, left Birmingham in canal boats stacked high with crates. The volume of trade increased so rapidly that new wharves and warehouses appeared along the canal banks within a year, reshaping the town's geography around water rather than roads. Housing followed production outward. Workers needed to live within walking distance of the canal-side workshops and forges, so entire neighborhoods sprouted along the waterways with minimal planning. Streets formed haphazardly, following the contours of the canal rather than any grid or design. Buildings pressed close together, maximizing the number of families that could settle near employment. Yards filled with coal stores, scrap metal, and the detritus of constant manufacturing. The town expanded faster than civic infrastructure could adapt, creating dense pockets of industry and residents that blurred into each other without clear boundaries. At its peak, the wider Birmingham Canal Navigations network reached roughly 160 miles of waterways. One reason people like to compare it to Venice. This comparison startled observers who still thought of Birmingham as landlocked and peripheral. The canal network branched through the town like veins, carrying raw materials inward and finished products outward in a circulatory system that never stopped moving. Yet this growth came with costs that became harder to ignore. Sanitation systems designed for a market town of a few thousand people now served tens of thousands, and clean water became scarce as the population climbed. Waste accumulated in streets and canals alike, turning parts of the town foul-smelling and unsanitary. Wealth concentrated in the hands of canal investors, factory owners, and merchants who controlled access to transport and markets. Workers earned steady wages but lived in conditions that deteriorated as density increased. Streets grew darker as buildings blocked light, and the constant noise of hammering, grinding, and barge traffic made silence rare. By 1820, Birmingham had become a victim of its own success. Expansion no longer felt like progress. It felt like pressure building without release. The year 1815 brought peace to Europe but turbulence to Birmingham. Thousands of demobilized soldiers flooded back into a town that had grown crowded during their absence. Seeking work in workshops already strained by post-war economic adjustment, grain prices remained high while wages stagnated, creating a gap between the cost of living and what most working families could earn. The manufacturing base that had absorbed population growth for decades now struggled to provide stable employment for everyone who needed it. Birmingham had become economically powerful yet politically voiceless, a contradiction that grew harder to justify as the town's contribution to national wealth became undeniable. Public meetings began drawing crowds that numbered in the thousands. Reformers, skilled workers, and even some manufacturers gathered in open spaces to discuss what they called the representation question. Birmingham produced more trade value than many parliamentary boroughs combined, yet it sent no member of parliament to Westminster. Ancient villages with populations in the hundreds held seats that industrial towns with tens of thousands lacked entirely. The system made no sense to people who watched their labor generate national wealth, while political power remained concentrated in rural landowners and aristocratic families who had never set foot in a factory or forge. Political unions emerged to channel this frustration into organized action. The Birmingham Political Union, formed in 1830, brought together middle-class reformers and working-class activists under a shared goal of parliamentary reform. They drafted petitions, organized mass meetings, and coordinated with similar groups across the country. The strategy relied on numbers and discipline rather than disruption. Leaders understood that violence would justify suppression, so they insisted on orderly demonstrations and lawful assembly. This approach set Birmingham apart from other reform movements that descended into riots and property destruction. Birmingham reformers deliberately rejected violence even when provoked. They believed moral authority and sheer numbers carried more weight than broken windows or burned buildings. Meetings followed strict rules, with marshals maintaining order and speakers emphasizing peaceful pressure rather than confrontation. Authorities watched nervously as crowds swelled to 15,000 or more, but the discipline held. Birmingham demonstrated that working people could organize politically without threatening social collapse, countering the argument that reform would lead to chaos. Tension climbed through 1831 and into 1832 as Parliament debated reform legislation. The House of Lords rejected the first reform bill, triggering protests across England. Birmingham's response remained controlled but unmistakable. Mass gatherings continued, petitions multiplied, and the political union coordinated a campaign of economic pressure through selective withholding of taxes and purchases. The government faced a choice between granting reform or using force against peaceful assemblies in dozens of towns simultaneously. The scale and organization made suppression impractical. When the Reform Act passed in June 1832, Birmingham received 2 parliamentary seats. The victory was partial. Property qualifications still excluded most working men from voting, but the principle had shifted. A town could now claim representation based on economic importance rather than medieval precedent. Birmingham had proven that sustained, organized, peaceful pressure could force constitutional change without revolution. The political union disbanded soon after, its immediate goal achieved. What remained was a political culture shaped by collective action and a belief that institutions could be reformed from outside when those inside refused to adapt. Birmingham entered the Victorian era with a voice in Parliament and a template for how industrial cities could claim power without taking up arms. Parliamentary representation arrived in 1832, and almost immediately, demand for Birmingham's output accelerated beyond anything the town had experienced before. The British Empire was expanding across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, creating markets that needed tools, weapons, hardware, and finished metal goods in quantities that dwarfed domestic consumption. Birmingham's workshops were already geared toward volume production. So when orders multiplied, the response was to build more workshops rather than fundamentally change how things were made. Streets filled with new buildings purpose-built for manufacturing. Presses stamped out metal components with rhythmic precision, lathes turned brass and steel into precise shapes, and furnaces burned constantly to keep pace with demand. The sound of mechanized labor became the town's permanent soundtrack. Hammering, grinding, and the hiss of steam engines operating in shifts that stretched into the night. Production no longer stopped at sunset. Gas lighting allowed work to continue after dark, effectively doubling the hours available for output. Birmingham manufactured an astonishing variety of metal goods. Jewelry workshops produced chains, brooches, and rings for domestic and export markets. Pen nibs rolled off assembly lines by the million, supplying the growing demand for written communication across the empire. Guns, bayonets, and military hardware left the town in shipments destined for colonial garrisons and European armies. Industrial components, screws, bolts, hinges, locks, connected Birmingham to construction projects and machinery production worldwide. The town had become a supplier to the entire industrial world, feeding other manufacturing centers with the small, essential parts that made larger systems function. Railways arrived in the 1830s and tightened Birmingham's connection to every major city and port in Britain. What had taken days by canal now took hours by rail. Raw materials arrived faster, finished goods departed faster, and the pace of commerce compressed into cycles measured in days rather than weeks. Railway stations became hubs of constant activity, with freight cars loaded and unloaded around the clock. Birmingham sat at the center of a rail network that bound it directly to Liverpool's docks, London's markets, and the coal and iron fields that fed its furnaces. By mid-century, Birmingham produced an estimated half of the world's metal buttons. This single statistic captured both the scale and the specialization that defined Victorian Birmingham. Buttons required precision tooling, efficient production methods, and supply chains capable of delivering millions of units to clothing manufacturers across continents. The town had mastered high-volume production of small, complex items, a capability that translated across dozens of other products. Wealth accumulated rapidly but concentrated in the hands of factory owners and merchants who controlled production and distribution. Working-class districts expanded outward in dense, poorly planned neighborhoods where housing quality declined as density increased. Families crowded into terraced houses built quickly and cheaply, often lacking adequate ventilation or sanitation. Smoke from thousands of furnaces and chimneys settled over the city, reducing visibility and coating buildings in soot. Respiratory illness became common, particularly among children and those working in poorly ventilated workshops. By 1870, Birmingham had transformed from an oversized town into a fully industrialized city. The Victorian manufacturing boom had reshaped not just the economy but the physical environment, the social structure, and the daily experience of living there. Manufacturing momentum had become self-reinforcing, pulling in labor, capital, and resources in a cycle that showed no signs of slowing. By the 1870s, Birmingham had wealth and output, but lacked the infrastructure to support either comfortably. Streets remained narrow and poorly maintained, water supply was inconsistent and often contaminated, and sanitation systems built for a smaller population now served hundreds of thousands. Private companies controlled gas and water, operating as monopolies that prioritized profit over service quality. The mismatch between economic power and civic function had become impossible to ignore, and pressure mounted for someone to address it systematically rather than piecemeal. Joseph Chamberlain entered municipal politics in 1869 after building a fortune manufacturing screws. He brought to city governance the same mindset that had made Birmingham's factories efficient: identify problems, remove obstacles, and implement solutions at scale. Elected mayor in 1873, Chamberlain argued that civic improvement was not charity but investment, and that a well-run city would attract more business than one that prioritized low taxes over functioning services. His approach treated municipal government as another form of enterprise, one where returns came in health, productivity, and long-term growth rather than immediate dividends. Chamberlain's first major move was to municipalize the gas supply in 1875. Birmingham purchased the private gas company outright, taking control of production and distribution. Profits that had previously enriched private shareholders now flowed into the city treasury, funding further improvements. Gas prices dropped for consumers while service expanded into neighborhoods the private company had ignored as unprofitable. The move startled other cities and sparked debate across Europe about whether essential services should remain in private hands or become public utilities. Birmingham had demonstrated that municipalization could work financially while improving access, providing a working model that other reformers studied closely. Water and sanitation followed the same pattern. The city bought out private water companies, invested in new reservoirs and distribution systems, and built sewage infrastructure that connected previously neglected districts. Streets were widened to accommodate increased traffic, with entire blocks demolished to create broader thoroughfares that reduced congestion and improved circulation. Slum clearances removed the worst housing, replacing cramped courts and alleys with planned developments that included better ventilation and access to light. Public buildings rose across the city as symbols of civic ambition. The Council House, completed in 1879, provided a grand headquarters for municipal government that rivaled anything built by private industry. Libraries opened in working-class neighborhoods, offering free access to books and reading rooms. Parks were laid out in areas previously dominated by industry, creating green spaces where none had existed. Schools expanded to accommodate more children, funded by rates collected more efficiently under the reformed administration. Resistance came from multiple directions. Private companies fought municipalization through legal challenges and parliamentary lobbying. Ratepayers objected to increased spending and higher taxes, arguing that government should remain small and services minimal. Yet Chamberlain pushed reforms through with remarkable speed, using his industrial background to argue that investment in infrastructure would pay dividends in productivity and public health. The reforms moved faster than opposition could organize effectively. Birmingham entered the 20th century producing goods that appeared in homes, factories, and military arsenals on every inhabited continent. The city's manufacturers had moved beyond serving British markets to embedding themselves in supply chains that stretched across the empire and into competing industrial nations. Orders arrived from Australia, India, South Africa, and the Americas, each requiring precision components, finished metalwork, or specialized machinery that Birmingham workshops had learned to produce efficiently and at scale. Factories consolidated and specialized further during this period. Rather than making complete products, many firms focused on specific components or processes, becoming suppliers to other manufacturers rather than direct retailers. Engineering firms produced machine parts for textile mills in Manchester and steam engines in Glasgow. Arms manufacturers supplied rifles, ammunition, and military hardware to the War Office and foreign governments. Precision industries turned out scientific instruments, electrical components, and mechanical parts that required tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. This specialization locked Birmingham into global networks where disruption in one market or supply line could ripple through the entire local economy. Bicycles became a major export industry, with Birmingham factories producing frames, gears, chains, and finished cycles shipped worldwide. The industry employed thousands and demonstrated Birmingham's ability to adapt metalworking expertise to new consumer products. Similar flexibility appeared in the production of motor vehicle components as early automobiles began appearing on British roads. Birmingham manufacturers supplied parts to emerging car makers, positioning themselves early in an industry that would reshape the century. Migration accelerated as factories demanded more labor than the local population could provide. Workers arrived from rural England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, drawn by wages that exceeded what agricultural work offered. Neighborhoods filled with newcomers, adding linguistic and cultural diversity while straining housing stock that had barely kept pace with previous growth. Boarding houses multiplied, families subdivided homes to take in lodgers, and new terraced housing spread outward into previously undeveloped land. Birmingham manufacturers supplied components to industries across 6 continents during this period. Screws, bolts, springs, and fasteners produced in Birmingham workshops held together machinery, buildings, and vehicles from Toronto to Calcutta. This global embedding happened without fanfare or recognition, as small parts rarely carried makers' marks or attracted attention. Yet the city's economic health increasingly depended on demand from places most residents would never visit. Electric lighting replaced gas in factories and streets, extending productive hours further while making the city safer and more navigable after dark. Electric trams appeared in 1904, moving workers across the city faster than horse-drawn transport had managed. Telephone exchanges connected businesses to distant clients within minutes, compressing decision-making cycles and accelerating the pace of commerce. The city felt smaller in daily experience even as its physical boundaries continued expanding. Prosperity and vulnerability grew together. Birmingham's wealth rested on international trade relationships that assumed stable shipping routes, predictable demand, and peaceful relations between nations. When diplomatic tensions rose in Europe after 1910, Birmingham's manufacturers watched nervously. Arms orders increased. But so did awareness that any major conflict would disrupt the global systems that kept factories running. By 1914, Birmingham stood fully integrated into an international economy that was about to collapse into war. War arrived in August 1914, and Birmingham's factories converted to military production within days. Workshop owners received government contracts to manufacture shells, bullets, rifles, and components for vehicles and aircraft. Civilian orders were canceled or postponed as the entire industrial base pivoted toward supplying the British Army and its allies. Production lines that had made bicycles and pens now stamped out ammunition casings and gun parts. The scale of demand exceeded anything peacetime manufacturing had required, pushing factories to expand shifts and hire workers at a pace that left no time for planning or adjustment. Women entered factories in numbers that would have been unthinkable before 1914. With men enlisting or being conscripted, Birmingham's manufacturers faced labor shortages that threatened output. Women filled roles operating lathes, presses, and assembly lines, performing work that had been restricted to men through custom rather than capability. By 1917, tens of thousands of women worked in Birmingham's munitions factories, earning wages that gave them financial independence many had never experienced. The war compressed social change into years instead of decades. Output climbed relentlessly, but the strain showed in housing conditions and public health. Factories ran multiple shifts to meet military quotas, leaving workers exhausted and more vulnerable to illness. Overcrowding worsened as munitions workers moved into the city faster than housing could expand. Tuberculosis and other respiratory diseases spread through densely packed neighborhoods where ventilation was poor and medical care limited. Birmingham sustained its war effort through sheer endurance rather than improved conditions. Peace in 1918 brought relief followed immediately by disruption. Government contracts ended abruptly, leaving factories without orders and workers without jobs. Unemployment surged as demobilized soldiers returned to a city that no longer needed wartime production levels. The economy contracted sharply, exposing how dependent Birmingham had become on military demand. Factories that had employed thousands during the war now operated at partial capacity or closed entirely. Suburban expansion accelerated through the 1920s and 1930s as housing development spread outward from the industrial core. Electric trams and buses made commuting practical, allowing families to escape congested inner districts for newer homes with gardens and better sanitation. The Outer Circle bus route connected suburban neighborhoods to the city center, reshaping daily movement patterns. Older industrial areas lost population while remaining centers of employment, creating a divide between where people worked and where they lived. Interwar Birmingham produced more automobiles than any British city except London. The Austin Motor Company and other manufacturers shifted Birmingham's industrial identity toward vehicle production, employing thousands in large factories that operated differently from traditional metal workshops. Assembly lines replaced craft production methods, and workers specialized in repetitive tasks rather than completing entire products. This transition marked a departure from the flexible, small-scale manufacturing that had defined Birmingham for centuries. Cinemas proliferated across the city, offering mass entertainment that was affordable and accessible. Department stores expanded, selling consumer goods that reflected rising living standards for those in steady employment. Yet economic anxiety persisted beneath the surface. Export markets remained unstable, unemployment never disappeared entirely, and the memory of post-war collapse made prosperity feel conditional. By 1939, Birmingham had recovered but not relaxed. Aware that international stability remained fragile and that another conflict would once again transform the city overnight. War returned in September 1939, and Birmingham's factories shifted back into military production with the efficiency of muscle memory. The city that had built weapons, vehicles, and munitions during the previous conflict now did so again, this time with industries that had modernized between wars. Aircraft components became the priority, with factories producing engines, fuselages, wings, and the thousands of smaller parts required to assemble bombers and fighters. Vehicle production expanded to meet military demand for trucks, tanks, and transport equipment. Weapons manufacture resumed at scales that matched or exceeded 1914 levels, and civilian production ceased almost entirely as the government directed every available resource toward warfare. Factory schedules governed daily life more completely than during the previous conflict. Shift work became universal, with production continuing around the clock to meet quotas set by military planners. Workers operated in conditions shaped entirely by urgency, as speed mattered more than comfort or safety. The rhythm of peacetime disappeared, replaced by the relentless pace of wartime manufacturing that allowed no pause. Birmingham became a target because of what it produced rather than what it symbolized. German planners identified the city's dispersed industrial base as critical to British war capacity, making it a priority for bombing campaigns designed to cripple output. Unlike London, where bombing aimed partly at morale and political impact, attacks on Birmingham focused on destroying the factories, warehouses, and transport networks that kept weapons flowing to British forces. Air raids began in August 1940 and continued intermittently through 1943. Night after night, families moved into shelters as sirens warned of approaching bombers. Explosions tore through residential streets alongside industrial zones, as the dispersed nature of Birmingham's workshops meant bombs aimed at factories often struck homes. The Luftwaffe dropped thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiary devices across the city, igniting fires that burned through entire blocks and collapsed buildings into rubble. Birmingham was among the most heavily bombed British cities, often described as the third most heavily bombed after London and Liverpool. The statistic reflected the city's importance to war production rather than its size or visibility. Factories scattered across dozens of neighborhoods meant destruction spread widely rather than concentrating in a single district. The human cost accumulated through repeated raids. Deaths numbered in the thousands, injuries in the tens of thousands, and displacement affected nearly every family. Production continued despite the destruction. Workshops hit by bombs often resumed operations within days, clearing debris and repairing machinery while waiting for replacement materials. The decentralized structure that made Birmingham vulnerable also made it resilient, as damage to one factory rarely halted an entire production chain. Workers returned to bombed sites and continued manufacturing the components, weapons, and vehicles that military operations required. Daily life compressed into cycles of work, shelter, rationing, and loss. Food became scarce and monotonous under rationing systems that allocated supplies strictly. Families sent children to rural areas for safety, fragmenting households for years. The city endured not through heroism or inspiration, but through the grinding necessity of continuing when stopping was not an option. When peace arrived in 1945, Birmingham stood damaged in ways both visible and structural. Buildings lay in ruins, infrastructure required extensive repair, and the population bore the accumulated exhaustion of 6 years under siege and production pressure. Yet the city remained economically essential, having sustained output that contributed directly to Allied victory. Survival had come at the cost of preservation. Peace in 1945 brought no pause for celebration in Birmingham. The city faced immediate decisions about what to preserve and what to demolish, with surveys revealing that war damage had exposed infrastructure problems that predated the bombing. Thousands of homes lacked indoor plumbing, entire districts had inadequate sewage systems, and Victorian-era housing that had deteriorated through decades of neglect now appeared genuinely unfit for habitation. Authorities moved quickly to declare large sections of the inner city as slum clearance zones, initiating programs that would reshape Birmingham more dramatically than 6 years of air raids had managed. Clearance programs accelerated through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, removing terrace streets where families had lived for generations. Planners erected modern housing estates and high-rise tower blocks designed to provide better living conditions while accommodating more residents per acre. The new buildings featured indoor bathrooms, central heating, and larger windows that admitted more light than the narrow Victorian terraces had allowed. Families moved from cramped backyard houses into flats with modern amenities, a transition many welcomed as overdue improvement. Movement through the city became the central obsession of post-war planning. Engineers designed road systems that prioritized automobile traffic over pedestrians, carving dual carriageways and ring roads through neighborhoods that had developed around walking distances and tram routes. The Inner Ring Road, constructed through the 1950s and 1960s, encircled the city center with elevated sections and underpasses that allowed continuous vehicle flow. Streets that had existed for centuries disappeared beneath concrete, replaced by structures that treated the city as a network of traffic arteries rather than a collection of interconnected places. Industry recovered faster than housing or infrastructure, with factories resuming peacetime production almost immediately. Birmingham's manufacturing base remained intact despite bombing damage, and demand for consumer goods surged as rationing ended and export markets reopened. Employment remained high through the 1950s, pulling in workers even as planners demolished the neighborhoods where many of them lived. Birmingham became one of Britain's most aggressively planned cities during this period. The pace and scale of redevelopment exceeded what most other cities attempted, driven by a confidence that modern design could solve problems inherited from unplanned industrial growth. Planners operated with powers granted by post-war reconstruction legislation, allowing them to acquire property, demolish structures, and rebuild without the lengthy consultations that would become standard decades later. Shopping centers replaced traditional high streets, concentrating retail in purpose-built complexes surrounded by car parks. The Bull Ring Center, opened in 1964, exemplified this approach. A concrete shopping complex connected to the city by underpasses and elevated walkways that separated pedestrians from vehicle traffic entirely. Concrete became the dominant building material, appearing in housing blocks, road structures, shopping centers, and civic buildings that projected efficiency and modernity while erasing architectural continuity with the pre-war city. reactions divided along lines of age and attachment. Younger families moving into new estates appreciated the improved facilities and space. Older residents experienced displacement from neighborhoods where they had spent entire lives, watching familiar streets vanish beneath bulldozers and ring roads. By 1965, Birmingham had been physically transformed in ways that would define its appearance for the next half-century, having traded historical continuity for a vision of efficiency that assumed cars, concrete, and separation of functions represented progress. By the late 1960s, the manufacturing base that had defined Birmingham for 2 centuries started coming apart. Global competition intensified as countries rebuilt after the war, with factories in Germany, Japan, and emerging economies producing goods more cheaply than British manufacturers could match. Technological changes reduced the labor required for many processes, making entire categories of skilled work obsolete. Orders declined, profit margins narrowed, and firms that had operated for generations began closing without warning or ceremony. Factory closures happened unevenly across the city. A metalworking shop that had employed 300 workers would shut down in one neighborhood while a nearby engineering firm continued operating, creating pockets of unemployment surrounded by areas where work remained available. The newer industries that emerged: electronics, services, administration, required different skills and offered fewer positions than the traditional manufacturing jobs they replaced. Workers who had spent decades mastering metalwork or precision assembly found themselves competing for positions that paid less and demanded retraining they hadn't anticipated needing. Immigration reshaped Birmingham's population during the same period. Workers from the Caribbean arrived through the 1950s and 1960s, recruited to fill labor shortages in factories, hospitals, and transport services. Migrants from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh followed, establishing communities in districts like Sparkbrook, Handsworth, and Small Heath. African and Asian families arrived through the 1970s, escaping political instability in Uganda, Kenya, and other former colonies. These migrations happened rapidly, transforming neighborhoods within a single decade. Cultural institutions emerged to serve the new communities. Mosques, temples, and gurdwaras appeared in converted buildings and purpose-built structures. Shops selling goods from the Caribbean, South Asia, and Africa opened along high streets, changing the commercial landscape. Community centers provided spaces for cultural events, language classes, and mutual support networks. Birmingham became one of the most ethnically diverse cities in Britain within a generation, driven by post-war labor needs and migration policies that encouraged Commonwealth citizens to settle in industrial cities. Tensions surfaced as economic decline and demographic change intersected. Competition for housing intensified in areas where both established residents and new arrivals sought affordable accommodation. Unemployment affected immigrant communities disproportionately as factories closed, creating frustration that authorities struggled to address. Policing became a flashpoint, with complaints about harassment and discriminatory treatment leading to distrust that deepened over time. The 1981 Handsworth riots exposed fractures that had been building for years, demonstrating how economic pressure and social friction could ignite when left unaddressed. Community networks responded where formal institutions failed to act quickly enough. Grassroots organizations formed to provide employment assistance, legal support, and advocacy for residents facing discrimination. Religious institutions extended beyond worship to become centers for social services and community organizing. Mutual aid networks developed within immigrant communities, pooling resources to help families navigate systems that were often hostile or indifferent. By the mid-1980s, Birmingham no longer functioned as a city built around manufacturing employment. The industrial base persisted but occupied a smaller share of the economy and workforce. The city faced uncertainty about what would replace the manufacturing jobs that had sustained it, while managing the social complexity of a population more diverse than at any point in its history. Reinvention would require more than economic adjustment. It demanded rethinking what Birmingham was becoming rather than preserving what had been. By the mid-1980s, Birmingham had accepted that waiting for manufacturing to return made no sense. The factories that had closed weren't coming back, and clinging to an industrial identity that no longer matched reality would only delay necessary adaptation. Attention shifted from preservation to transformation, treating abandoned industrial sites not as losses but as opportunities to build something different. Disused factories became the raw material for redevelopment. Buildings that had housed metalworking shops and assembly lines were gutted and converted into office space, apartments, and cultural venues. Entire industrial districts were cleared, the land remediated and rezoned for residential or commercial use. The jewelry quarter retained some of its manufacturing character while adding restaurants, bars, and creative businesses that occupied former workshop spaces. Brindley Place rose on land that had been canal-side warehouses and derelict industrial plots, transforming into a mixed-use development of offices, restaurants, and public spaces that attracted financial services firms and professional workers. Employment patterns shifted decisively away from manufacturing toward services, finance, education, and administration. Banks and insurance companies opened regional headquarters in Birmingham, drawn by lower costs than London, and a central location within the national transport network. Universities expanded, employing more staff and enrolling more students who stayed in the city after graduation. Retail and hospitality sectors grew to serve the changing population, creating jobs that looked nothing like the factory work that had dominated for generations. Major redevelopment projects reshaped the city center's relationship with pedestrians and public space. The concrete structures of the 1960s had created a city designed for cars with underpasses and elevated walkways separating people from street level. New projects reversed this logic, removing some of the inner ring road sections and opening the city center to foot traffic. Centenary Square was redesigned as an open plaza surrounded by civic buildings accessible directly from surrounding streets rather than through tunnels. Victoria Square was pedestrianized and expanded, creating gathering spaces where none had existed during the concrete planning era. Areas dismissed as industrial wastelands during the 1970s became some of the city's most expensive real estate by the 2000s. Canal-side apartments in developments like the Mailbox commanded prices that would have seemed absurd when the same land held abandoned warehouses. The transformation demonstrated how quickly urban value could shift when function changed, turning liabilities into assets within 2 decades. Cultural identity gained importance as Birmingham worked to redefine itself beyond manufacturing. Music scenes emerging from the city, heavy metal, reggae, Bhangra, gave Birmingham cultural cachet that manufacturing output never had. Aston Villa and Birmingham City FC provided identity and community connection that transcended economic change. The Birmingham Royal Ballet and City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra reinforced the idea that Birmingham offered cultural depth alongside economic activity. Regeneration distributed benefits unevenly across the city. The center and adjacent redevelopment zones attracted investment and improved dramatically, while outer districts saw less transformation and continued struggling with unemployment and underfunded services. Communities that had relied on manufacturing found themselves geographically and economically separated from the new service economy taking shape in the center. Entering the 2010s, Birmingham operated without a single defining characteristic. The city that had been the workshop of the world, then struggled through deindustrialization, now existed as multiple places layered on top of each other. Manufacturing persisted in pockets, services dominated employment statistics, universities shaped entire neighborhoods, and cultural industries created identities that had nothing to do with metal or machines. Infrastructure projects reshaped how the city moved and connected. HS2 was promoted as a way to cut Birmingham-London journeys to under an hour, but the project was later scaled back, leaving London-Birmingham as the core high-speed line. The Midland Metro tram system expanded, linking previously disconnected districts and making movement across the city faster than buses or cars could manage during peak hours. Digital infrastructure became as important as physical transport, with fiber optic networks and tech hubs attracting companies that operated entirely online. The city center underwent continuous redevelopment, replacing concrete structures from the 1960s with glass-fronted buildings, pedestrian zones, and public spaces designed for gathering rather than just moving through. Universities grew into major economic forces. The University of Birmingham, Birmingham City University, and Aston University collectively employed tens of thousands and enrolled over 100,000 students. Graduates stayed in higher numbers than previous generations, drawn by lower living costs than London and employment opportunities in sectors that hadn't existed decades earlier. Creative industries clustered around Digbeth and the Custard Factory, converting old industrial buildings into studios, galleries, and co-working spaces. Technology firms opened offices, hiring software developers, designers, and digital specialists whose work bore no resemblance to the manufacturing jobs that had once dominated. Historic manufacturing districts existed alongside 21st century development, creating visual contrasts that compress centuries into walking distances. Victorian factories stood next to glass office towers. Canal paths that had carried coal and iron now served joggers and cyclists. The jewelry quarter retained working jewelers while adding coffee shops and creative agencies. These layers didn't blend. They coexisted, creating a city that felt fragmented rather than unified. Birmingham became the youngest major city in Europe by median age during this period. The statistic reflected immigration patterns, birth rates, and the influx of students who stayed after graduation. This demographic reality meant the city's future would be shaped by populations with no memory of industrial Birmingham, who experienced it only as a service economy city with manufacturing heritage visible in building names and repurposed structures. Inequality persisted despite visible prosperity. Wealth concentrated in the city's center and adjacent regeneration zones, while outer districts struggled with underfunded services, limited transport connections, and higher unemployment. The gap between thriving and struggling neighborhoods widened even as overall economic indicators improved, creating parallel experiences of Birmingham that depended entirely on geography and access. cultural diversity became structural rather than transitional. Caribbean, South Asian, Middle Eastern, African, and Eastern European communities shaped the city's food, music, business networks, and global connections. Birmingham's diversity stopped being discussed as recent immigration and became recognized as permanent character, embedded across generations. Birmingham's past was a constant cycle of change that never truly stopped. Subscribe for more documentary stories that uncover how history shaped the world around us.